Buildings don't bury themselves, yet across every major city on Earth you'll find elaborate doorways, pristine windows, and ornate architectural details sitting 10, sometimes 15 feet below current street level. In 2026, excavation teams working on metro expansions in 5 cities simultaneously uncovered something that made archaeologists very uncomfortable. Structures that shouldn't exist at those depths, layers that don't match any accepted timeline, evidence that suggests our cities might be built on top of something we've collectively agreed not to discuss. The official explanation is simple. Cities accumulate waste over centuries, streets rise gradually, buildings sink into cultural layers of human debris. Archaeologists have been saying this for decades, and the math works. Half an inch of accumulation every 100 years, 50 inches per millennium. Neat, predictable, scientifically sound. But here's what the textbooks don't mention. That accumulation rate assumes organic growth, continuous occupation, and gradual change. It doesn't explain why entire ground floors with intact windows, functioning doorways, and undamaged stonework sit completely submerged. It doesn't explain why these buried levels often show no signs of gradual burial, no layers of trash or debris between the original ground floor and the one we use today. And it definitely doesn't explain why excavation teams in 2026 kept finding the same pattern in cities separated by thousands of miles. St. Petersburg's metro expansion hit buried structures at depths that puzzled even veteran archaeologists. Not Roman ruins, not medieval foundations. 19th century buildings, some with construction dates in municipal records, sitting 12 feet below modern street level. The cultural layer theory suggests this would take roughly 2,000 years to accumulate naturally. These buildings were supposedly constructed less than 200 years ago. London's Crossrail project exposed similar anomalies. Entire Victorian-era basements, sealed and preserved, found at depths inconsistent with their documented age. When engineers drained flooded sections, they discovered doorways that opened onto brick walls, windows that faced solid earth, staircases that descended into chambers no modern map acknowledged. The project documentation carefully avoided asking why. They measured, photographed, catalogued, and moved on. San Francisco's excavations revealed something even stranger. Buildings from the 1850s gold rush era, structures with verified construction records and historical photographs, discovered with their ground floors completely buried, not partially obscured, fully submerged. The explanation offered was earthquake-related settling and landfill operations. Except the landfill records don't account for the volume of material required, and the settling patterns don't match seismic activity models. You start to notice something when you examine enough of these sites. The buried architecture isn't crude or deteriorated. It's often more precisely constructed than what sits above it. Stonework with joints so tight you can't slide paper between blocks. Archways with mathematical precision. Foundations that seem over-engineered for the buildings they supposedly supported. Almost as if whoever built them expected to bear significantly more weight than the structures we see today. Moscow's recent metro expansion uncovered this pattern at scale. Beneath Stalin-era construction, beneath Tsarist-era buildings, they found layers of architectural sophistication that increased with depth. The deeper they went, the better the craftsmanship became. This inverts everything we think we know about technological progress. Civilizations are supposed to build more sophisticated structures over time, not less. The Mudflood theory emerged from these observations, not from fringe forums or conspiracy theorists, but from people examining historical photographs and asking simple questions. Why do so many 19th century buildings in cities across the world show evidence of excavation rather than construction? Why do period photographs from the 1850s through 1890s consistently depict workers digging out buildings rather than building them up? There's a photograph from Omaha, Nebraska taken in 1908. 19 odds Erne. St. Mary Magdalene Catholic Church, freshly excavated. What the photograph shows isn't construction, it's archaeological recovery. Workers standing beside a building they've uncovered, exposing windows that have been completely underground. The church records list it as built in 1908, but the photograph shows something already there, already complete, simply buried. This pattern repeats in city after city. Photographs labelled as construction projects that clearly show excavation work. Buildings described as newly built that appear weathered and aged in their first photographs. Municipal records that don't quite match the physical evidence. It's subtle enough that most people never notice. But once you see it, it's everywhere. The standard explanation attributes this to basement excavations and foundation work. Reasonable enough for isolated cases. But when you find the same pattern in hundreds of cities, when the excavated levels show consistent architectural features, when the buried structures often exceed the documented buildings in both scale and craftsmanship, coincidence stops being a satisfactory answer. What happened in the 19th century that required cities across the world to dig themselves out? Why do historical records from that period contain so many references to unusual weather events, atmospheric phenomena, and unexplained accumulations of sediment? Why did cartographers suddenly stop labelling vast regions of Central Asia as Tartaria around the same time these burial patterns appear? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're documented historical puzzles that archaeology has quietly filed away as answered without actually providing answers that withstand scrutiny. The 2026 excavations didn't create these questions. They just made them impossible to ignore. Because what those excavation teams found wasn't just buried buildings. They found evidence of coordination, similar burial depths across unconnected cities, comparable architectural styles in structures that supposedly had no contact, construction techniques that appear in multiple locations simultaneously, with no documented method of transmission, patterns that suggest something larger than local flooding or gradual accumulation, something that affected multiple continents at roughly the same time. The coordination itself tells a story. Buildings buried at consistent depths across continents. Architectural elements that mirror each other despite supposed isolation. Decorative patterns that repeat in cities separated by oceans. This isn't random accumulation. Random doesn't produce uniformity. Consider what coordination at that scale actually requires. Information exchange, shared design principles, common construction methods. Yet the historical record shows none of this. No documented trade routes extensive enough to explain the architectural similarities. No known communication networks capable of spreading building techniques across such distances in that time frame. The 19th century had telegraphs and railways, sure, but those came after most of these structures appeared. The buildings were already there when those technologies arrived. Here's what the excavation teams kept finding. Beneath structures dated to the 1850s, they uncovered foundations clearly older, not centuries older, millennia older. Stone dressed with techniques that predate recorded masonry traditions. Mortar compositions that don't match any known formula from that period. Tool marks inconsistent with documented 19th century equipment. One site in San Francisco revealed something particularly strange. Excavators removed sediment from what municipal records listed as an 1870s commercial building. Standard excavation work, nothing unusual. Until they reached the foundation level and found it sitting atop another complete structure. Not ruins, not rubble. An intact building, perfectly preserved, buried beneath what was supposedly built first. The lower structure showed no signs of demolition, no evidence of intentional burial, just sediment. Massive accumulation of sediment that filled every space, every corridor, every room, as if deposited in a single event rather than gradual accumulation over time. Sediment analysis made it stranger. The composition was uniform throughout. Same mineral content, same particle size distribution, same everything. As if it all arrived at once from the same source. Geological surveys of the surrounding area found no natural explanation for that volume of material appearing in that location. You can explain away one site, maybe two. But when the same pattern emerges in dozens of cities, when the sediment characteristics match across continents, when the burial depths cluster around the same measurements, You're looking at something systematic. The photographic evidence from that era compounds the mystery. Not just the excavation images, but what those images were labelled as. Construction photographs that clearly show removal rather than assembly. Workers positioned as if uncovering rather than building. Equipment designed for excavation are not construction, yet the captions consistently read construction in progress or new building project. Someone was relabeling what actually happened. Municipal records from the 1850s through 1880s contain another curiosity. Frequent mentions of unusual atmospheric conditions, descriptions of skies darkened for days, references to ashfall and sediment rain, weather phenomena that don't quite match known volcanic events or dust storms. These entries appear in city records from locations too dispersed to share local weather patterns. Then there's the timeline compression. Historical records suggest certain buildings took mere months to complete. Structures of such architectural complexity that modern engineers estimate would require years using period technology. The official explanation attributes this to superior craftsmanship and efficient labour organisation. But efficiency doesn't bend the laws of physics. Stone doesn't cure faster because workers are motivated. Unless they weren't building at all, unless they were simply excavating what already existed and documenting it as new construction. The evidence sits in plain sight once you know what you're looking at. Architectural directories from the 1870s list construction dates that predate the supposed architects' births. Building permits filed after structures already appeared in city photographs. Foundation inspections describing wear patterns inconsistent with new construction. The 2026 excavations found something else. Beneath multiple sites, they discovered drainage systems, not simple channels or basic sewers. Sophisticated hydraulic networks with flow calculations that demonstrate advanced engineering understanding. These systems were buried under the buildings supposedly constructed in the 19th century. Yet they functioned perfectly when cleared of sediment. Someone built infrastructure for cities that didn't officially exist yet. Or more accurately, someone built cities that later civilizations claimed as their own after digging them out of however many feet of earth had buried them. The burial mechanism matters less than what it reveals. Whether catastrophic flooding, atmospheric deposition, or some other process, the effect was the same. A civilization's worth of architecture suddenly inaccessible, then gradually recovered and reoccupied by whoever came after. Maps provide another layer of evidence. Cartographic records from the early 1800s show vast territories labelled with names that vanished by century's end. Not conquered and renamed, just erased as if the map makers decided those regions never existed. The timing aligns perfectly with when excavation photographs begin appearing in city archives. What was buried wasn't just buildings, it was memory. Cultural continuity, the knowledge of who actually built what we now inhabit. And perhaps that erasure wasn't accidental. Perhaps someone decided the previous civilization's existence posed inconvenient questions about legitimacy, about inheritance, about who actually owns the architectural legacy we've claimed as our own achievement. The deeper you examine the evidence, the more the official narrative fractures. Buildings that shouldn't exist appearing in impossible timeframes, construction records that contradict physical evidence, photographs showing excavation labelled as construction, architectural sophistication that appears fully formed with no developmental precedent. Something happened in the 19th century that transformed buried cities into newly built ones through nothing more than relabeling and selective documentation. The question isn't whether this occurred. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is why we've collectively agreed to accept the revised version without examining what the original story actually was. The architecture tells you everything if you're willing to look. Walk through any major city built during the industrial expansion. Notice how certain buildings don't match their supposed construction dates. The weathering patterns are wrong. Stone that should show a century of exposure looks like it's endured 3. Mortar joints displaying erosion inconsistent with their documented age. Foundations exhibiting settling that requires far more time than the official timeline allows. You'll find doorways partially buried, their full height only visible after excavation. Windows that start below modern street level, their lower portions filled in or bricked over. Basements that were clearly first floors, their ceiling heights too generous for underground spaces. These aren't design choices. They're adaptations, modifications made by people who found structures already buried and decided to work with what was accessible rather than excavate the full depth. The official explanation points to cultural layers, centuries of accumulated debris, waste, and sediment gradually raising street levels. This happens. Archaeological science documents it thoroughly. But the rate matters. Standard accumulation builds roughly half an inch per century. To bury a 10-foot tall doorway requires 2,000 years of undisturbed sediment deposition. Most cities claiming this burial pattern were supposedly founded less than 300 years before the excavation photographs were taken. The math doesn't work unless something accelerated the process dramatically. Soil liquefaction provides one mechanism. When earthquakes strike water-saturated ground, the earth temporarily behaves like liquid. Structures sink, sediment flows, and what stood at ground level can drop several feet in seconds. This occurred during World War I bombardments. Soldiers near exploding shells literally fell through liquefying mud, buried alive before they could react. The phenomenon is real, documented, repeatable in laboratory conditions. But liquefaction requires specific geological conditions: saturated soil, seismic activity, particular sediment compositions. It doesn't explain burial patterns in cities built on bedrock or well-drained terrain. It doesn't account for the uniformity of burial depth across regions with vastly different geological profiles. Atmospheric deposition offers another possibility. Volcanic eruptions can blanket entire regions with ash. Dust storms deposit sediment over vast areas. Yet the burial we're discussing isn't ash or dust. It's consolidated earth, mixed sediment, material that shows signs of water transport and deposition. The kind of sediment you'd expect from flooding, not atmospheric fallout. Which brings us back to water. Massive flooding can deposit enormous quantities of sediment rapidly. The 1910 Paris flood left several feet of silt in places. Multiply that by a factor of 10 and you approach the burial depths found in excavation records. But where's the water source? What catastrophic flood covered multiple continents simultaneously during the early 19th century? Historical records from that period mention unusual weather. Darkened skies, prolonged atmospheric disturbances, crop failures, temperature anomalies. The year 1816 became known as the year without summer. Volcanic activity from Mount Tambora caused global climate disruption. But volcanic winters don't bury cities. They destroy crops and lower temperatures. The burial mechanism remains unexplained. Perhaps the mechanism matters less than recognizing what the evidence demonstrates. Something buried significant portions of urban infrastructure between the late 18th and mid-19th centuries. Whether through flooding, seismic liquefaction, atmospheric deposition, or some combination we haven't fully documented, the result was the same. Architecture became inaccessible, requiring excavation to reoccupy. The excavation photographs show this clearly. Workers standing in pits beside buildings, removing earth from around doorways and windows. Images captioned as construction documentation that clearly depict excavation operations. The distinction matters because construction implies creation while excavation implies recovery. What we've inherited isn't necessarily what we built. The grand municipal buildings, the precisely engineered infrastructure, the architectural sophistication that appeared seemingly overnight during industrial expansion. Much of it may have been recovered rather than created, excavated from burial, cleaned, repaired, and reoccupied by civilizations that then claimed it as their own achievement. This doesn't require conspiracy. It requires convenience. If you find magnificent structures buried under 10 feet of earth, do you credit them to unknown predecessors or claim them as evidence of your own civilization's greatness? The choice becomes obvious when legitimacy and cultural pride are at stake. The evidence remains. Buried doorways, impossible construction timelines, architectural sophistication without developmental precedent, drainage systems more advanced than the supposed builders could design. Each piece alone might be dismissed. Together they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. We occupy a world we didn't entirely create. The foundations beneath modern cities, the infrastructure we've inherited, the architectural legacy we claim may belong to others who came before. Others who built on scales and timelines that challenge everything we've been taught about recent history. The 19th century wasn't just an age of industrial revolution. It was an age of industrial excavation. An era when buried cities were systematically uncovered, cleaned and reoccupied. When architectural achievements were claimed by those who found them rather than those who built them. And now you see it too. The windows below street level, the buried doorways, the foundations too sophisticated for their supposed age. Not anomalies, evidence. Evidence that what we call history might be nothing more than the story we tell ourselves about structures we discovered rather than designed. The question isn't whether this happened. The evidence makes that clear. The question is, what else remains buried, waiting for the next excavation to reveal what we've forgotten or been taught to ignore? The 2026 excavations didn't answer these questions. They simply made them unavoidable. Each new metro tunnel, each foundation dig, each infrastructure project exposes more of what lies beneath. More doorways that shouldn't be underground. More architecture that doesn't match its documented timeline. More evidence that the cities we inhabit have stories their builders never recorded. You can dismiss individual anomalies, explain away single sites, attribute isolated findings to local conditions. But when the pattern repeats across continents, when the burial depths align, when the architectural sophistication increases with depth rather than decreasing, dismissal becomes denial. The structures remain. The photographs exist. The municipal records contradict the physical evidence in ways that become harder to ignore with each excavation season. What we've built our modern world upon may not be the foundation we think it is. And perhaps that's why these discoveries get catalogued, photographed, and quietly archived without the investigation they deserve. Because truly examining them means questioning not just what happened in the 19th century, but who we are in relation to what came before. The ground beneath your feet remembers, even if the history books have chosen to forget.